I know we have some folks kind of jumping in here in a few minutes, but I think we're gonna get started here. I want to thank you all for making time on this Thursday evening and early summer to spend some time online during New York State's Invasive Species Awareness Week to learn about invasive species here in the Adirondack. So thanks for being here. I'm Tom Collins. I'm the Education and Outreach Program Manager for the Paul Smith College Adirondack Watershed Institute. And tonight really is an opportunity for us to learn about some of the research that's come out of our stewardship program from all the wonderful data that our watercraft inspection stewards have collected across the Adirondack Park over the past several years. So with doing that, we're going to run this as a webinar. So if y'all haven't been on a webinar before, you'll notice that there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen as well as a chat. Feel free to add any questions into the Q&A and any comments or suggestions or ideas or funny thoughts into the chat. And I'll be sure to catch those as we move forward this evening. We won't be able to see each other's face, but if you have any issues seeing the screen tonight, feel free to put that in the chat or message me individually, and I'll try to work with you. So thanks for taking the time tonight. I want to introduce our speaker this evening, my colleague, Dr. Michale Glennon. Michale is a senior research scientist at the Paul Smith College Adirondack Watershed Institute. She is an ecologist and traditionally has used wildlife as a tool for understanding threats to ecological integrity and watershed health. In her role, Michale provides leadership to AWI's scientific research program, supports high-quality research opportunities for students, and advocates for AWI science to shape the management and stewardship of the natural resources of the Adirondack Park. She's authored more than 30 publications in peer-reviewed journals and book chapters, and is a member of the editorial board for the Journal of Field Ecology. She's also a board member for the Adirondack Council in Traditional Arts in upstate New York. Michale obtained her bachelor's in science in environmental and evolutionary biology from Dartmouth College, and her master's and PhD in environmental and forest biology from SUNY ESF. And Michale lives in Raybrook, New York with her husband, Scott, and 2 kids and wonderful goat. And very fortunate to have Michale taking the time to join us tonight. Michale is going to speak about 2 research reports that have come out of this wonderful data that all our watercraft inspection stewards have produced over the years. So thank you, Michale, for being here. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Michale, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Welcome, everyone, and appreciate you being here. As Tom said, I'm an ecologist, so you're joining us for the talk in which I masquerade as an invasive species biologist, but I'll do my best. But you'll see as I get into this talk that it's pretty simplistic sorts of questions that we've been asking with this project, and I just happen to be the person that has inherited the data analysis component of this. I didn't do any of the hard work of the data collection part of this, which is done by our many boat stewards that are working throughout the park. But I'm happy to share with you some of the things that we've been learning in the past few years. Aren't we going to my next? There we go. So as Tom mentioned, this is a program of AWI. I hope that you are familiar with us. If you're not, we are a program of Paul Smith College. We are all about protecting clean water and healthy watersheds. And we do that sort of through 3 different primary pillars, one of which is our stewardship program, one of which is our science program, and then communication and community. And that's really Tom's focus. And the work that I'll talk about tonight is sort of somewhere in between all 3 of these, because I am using the data from our stewardship program to get into the science, and then hopefully use it to provide information for education and our outreach efforts. So our stewardship program and the data that have been generated by it are the focus of what I'll speak about. And this program has a long history now. We started on 1 lake in 2000 with a handful of employees, and here we are in 2024. I believe we hired 114 or something like that stewards for this season, and each year nowadays we work on 50 to 60 lakes, and we also operate something in the neighborhood of 27 decontamination stations all throughout the Adirondack Park and northern part of New York State. So it's become a very large and robust program and a key part of what we do at AWI. The main goals, of course, are to prevent the introduction of new aquatic invasive species and to limit the spread of those that we already have here. there's some sort of greatest hits that I compiled last year when I presented some of this information for the Adirondack Lakes Alliance. But what I want to focus on in this slide is just to mention that this work is very much a partnership of us with lots of other folks. The DEC, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, is the funder of our stewardship program for the most part, funding a large part of the work that we do with the boat stewards, but we do it very much working in collaboration with other organizations that are also concerned with aquatic invasive species. The Lake George Park Commission and the Basin Program are close partners, both of whom let us make use of their data for part of what I'll present to you this evening. And of course, APIP, a program of the Nature Conservancy, is very heavily focused on invasive species as well. So I do want to call out our really important collaborators in all of this. So the first project I'll talk about, we sort of nicknamed the Pathways Project, and this is one of two grants that we were awarded by the New York State DEC in 2019, I believe, right around the time that I came to Paul Smith's. And it's really all about thinking about how we allocate the resources that we have in the most effective way, understanding that we don't have unlimited resources, and nobody does. And so how do we think about how to manage our own system, but also to provide recommendations in other regions who might be grappling with similar sorts of issues? Depending on who you ask, the Adirondacks has as many as 11,000 lakes and ponds. There's no possible way that we could be present at all of those, trying to prevent the bad organisms from arriving. And even for the ones that we can be present, the 60 or so each summer, we're not there 24 hours a day. So we have lots of strategic decisions to make each year about sort of how do we spend the precious resources that we have. And this research is really about trying to understand some of the key drivers and threats, and which lakes are the ones that we really need to worry about for a variety of reasons. So the objectives are fairly straightforward. The first one was to predict the spatial pattern and intensity of recreational boating. And that's because, although there are some other mechanisms, the primary way that these organisms arrive in our waterways is on our watercraft. And so question one is to look at sort of that aspect of the invasion process that has to do with what's referred to as propagule pressure. So for us, those propagules are boats. How many boats are going to a given lake? The second one was to look at the abundance and distribution of aquatic invasive species. Just because they arrive at a given lake doesn't mean that they will become a problem in that lake. So in that question, we wanted to investigate the patterns of lakes that have and don't have aquatic invasive species and what sort of the predictors are of that. And then we want to kind of take this information and put it together and learn about, which lakes are the ones, again, that are problematic, that we need to think about making sure that we have resourced each year. So starting with that first question, which lakes are vulnerable? Because they get lots and lots of boats. This, of course, is a photo from the 90-miler canoe race, but I will just mention that there's generally a greater threat associated with motorized watercraft than non-motorized, although we check them all, just because there's more places for aquatic invasive species to hide in a motorboat. But this first question is really all about which lakes get the most boats on them. And so the process that we undertook for both this component and the next one that I'll talk about was very similar, and that is to start by compiling all the information that we have. And in this case, we were using data from 2015 through 2020 for lakes that we had the best sort of pattern established for, how many boats are coming in and out each day. That was about 40 lakes. And then to compile a whole bunch of attribute information about those lakes that we think might explain the numbers of boats on them. So physical characteristics, like how big are these lakes, how deep, are they hydrologically connected to other waterways? Aesthetic characteristics, what does the shoreline look like? Are there things that might make them more attractive or less attractive as a recreational resource? And then, of course, all the sort of social amenities that might make it a favorable place to go with your boat. Can you rent a boat there? Can you camp there? Is there a campground? How many boat launches? What sort of fish are in the lake? All that sort of thing. And so the process really was to then model which of these predictors best tells us about the lakes that have lots and lots of boats on them. And what we find when we do that is that the or not you have a marina. So not rocket science, but useful for us to understand. I'm just going to divert for a second into some other kind of tidbits that we pulled out of these data because they're interesting. We are interested in thinking about aquatic invasive species, but of course there's other reasons why we might want to understand recreation patterns on these lakes. So we learned that, at least in the lakes we were looking at, the motorboats are far more numerous than other watercraft type. They are launching primarily in July and August, although for motorboats, there is also a large peak in May, which is often people that are launching their boat for the first time that season, and then it often will stay in that lake for the rest of the season. They're usually on weekends, except canoeists who appear to be happy to go canoeing any day. These are the 4 watercraft types that we modeled. I'm going to mostly just talk about motorboats, but PWC refers to personal watercraft or jet skis. They're mostly right in the middle of the day. Generally, sort of the lunch hour is when most people are going out from the launch. But one thing we did find that I thought was interesting and perhaps worthy of paying attention to when we plan is that on a couple of our big lakes, Lake George and Lake Champlain, there are some distinct peaks of boats launching either before 8 in the morning, early, or in the evening. And we all know, of course, being on the lake in the evening is a lovely time to be on the lake, but there's also in the morning times, often they'll have these big groups of boats go out, particularly if there is a fishing derby or something scheduled. And so on those lakes, often there is the capacity to add additional steward coverage during those times. We can't do that for the most part on our lakes. We're, working generally between the hours of 8 to 4, 9 to 5 kinds of things. And so it's important to think about, what might be missed on some of those lakes. Luckily, on some of the bigger ones, we can add the capacity to get that coverage. So the second question, once the species arrive at these lakes, what makes the lakes vulnerable to them actually becoming established and becoming a problem in a given lake? And so this one has to do with data that we've collected as part of our aquatic plant surveys, which we have done in the park for a long time, and those are now done by a different organization. One of the issues that we run into, which is a good problem to have, is that we just don't have enough data or occurrence of species other than the 2 milfoils to really ask this question in a robust way. We have other species that are established in our lakes, but there are so few of those instances in the data that we have that we really can't understand well what the predictors are. For example, some of the mussel species like Asian clam and zebra mussel rely on calcium substrates that we just don't really have in most of the Adirondack lakes, and that means they're generally confined to Lake Champlain or on the eastern edge of the park. But the 2 that we do have kind of enough occurrences and therefore enough data to model and figure out the predictors are the 2 milfoil species. They are the most well established in our landscape. And so we looked at the same sort of process, again, looking at physical characteristics of lakes, how close by are other AIS infestations located? Are they hydrologically connected? What are human use sort of and impact factors that might be predictors of where these species are? And then for a subset of the data, we also had chemical information from our long-term water quality monitoring program. So for a subset of lakes, we had information on things like pH and alkalinity, which are also known to be predictors for the occurrence of some of these species. And so just looking at those 2 that we were able to model, we found that for Eurasian water milfoil, it was best predicted, most likely to occur by longitude, by the number of upstream invaded waterways. How many waterways upstream already had Eurasian water milfoil? It was positively associated with a rich native plant community. And then on that smaller set of lakes that we could do this for, it was also positively associated with alkalinity and calcium. If you look at the distribution of the 2 milfoils in the Adirondack Park, they do have sort of an east-west patterning, whereby on the eastern part of our landscape, the Eurasian water milfoil is much more prevalent, and in the western lakes, the other species, the variable leaf, is more prevalent. So that probably has to do with where they came from in the first place and sort of how they have spread in this landscape. And then when we look at variable leaf, some of the same predictors were also important in explaining patterns of where variable leaf is in Adirondack waters, namely, again, the number of upstream invaded waters that already had that species. And again, the native plant community richness was important, and in both cases, it was a positive predictor, positively associated with the occurrence of the milfoils. And then in this case, the number of amenities, so that's a compilation of, how many boat launches and campgrounds and marinas and all that stuff is on a given lake. And then for this species, pH was a negative predictor, as was alkalinity. And I think the chemical parameters in particular sort of point out the challenge of modeling some of these things. Some of these predictors we can expect to be important sort of across most invasive species, like how many boats arrive at a given place, but some of them are strictly due to the sort of biological characteristics, and they're all different organisms, and they all have different sort of things that they have affinities for, and so it's hard to come up with a universal good model for where we are likely to get an infestation of a given species. So then the last thing we want to do is sort of take this information and put it together and identify the lakes that are, kind of the problematic ones that we really, really need to be focused on. This is a sort of a screenshot from one of our past reports, and our colleague Sue O'Reilly used to make, I'm not sure if she still does, these super cool spider diagrams that arise from one question that we ask folks at the boat launches, and that is the question of, where were you before you came here? We ask lots and lots of questions, and I'm going to get into that in a minute when I talk about the second research project, but I would argue that is potentially the most important question. And because we have that information about what previous water body people have come from, and because we know which lakes already have AIS established in them, we can sort of look at those problematic connections. And you can see from this sort of diagram that was done just by brute force mapping that, it's a really complex system. Nowadays, we can use something called network analysis. You may have seen these types of analyses. These are called network graphs. The two sort of elements in a graph are the dots, which in our case are lakes. Those are called the nodes. So for us, those are the lakes, and then all the connections between them. So we know those connections because we have asked the question, what lake did you come for? We know that you came from here to here, therefore we can draw a line and connect those two locations. This sort of analysis is often used in things like analyzing really complex traffic patterns and trying to figure out the most easy, effective way to get from point A to point B, or looking at social networks and looking at the most influential websites or people on the internet. So we can use that same kind of approach to look at our data and look at which lakes are really sort of central hubs and highly, highly connected to other lakes. So lakes that have what's called high centrality just have bunches of connections to other lakes. They can reach other lakes more quickly, or they might be important sort of control points. The quickest point, connector between two distant lakes might be a given lake. And so that's what we were looking for in measuring several different aspects of what's called centrality, basically how central is a given lake in these networks. And so here's what the network looks like for those 39 lakes that I talked about previously. They are not representative of where they are on the Adirondack landscape. This is just the graphic that the computer spits back out at you so that you can sort of see them all. But one thing to note is that that's showing you all the connections ingoing and outgoing between each of those lakes. Another thing to note is that the size of the bubbles is an indicator of how connected that lake is to all the other ones. So the big lakes with big circles around them, Racket Lake, Long Lake, Tupper Lake, Great Sacandaga, Lake George, Lake Champlain, Saratoga Lake, those are really kind of the central hubs in our system. And some of the other lakes like Higley Flow or Lake Eaton or White Lake down in the southwest part of the park have far fewer connections associated with them. We can also identify things like subnetworks. We can look for little groupings of lakes within the bigger network, and we can sort of see a pattern of a High Peaks network of lakes, another one down in the Fulton chain, and then sort of this Northway group. And this is similar to past research that has analyzed the same data, but with a much smaller number of lakes and a much smaller sort of data set. But we do see that these subnetworks seem to be kind of stable. I had some additional space on this slide, so I just wanted to show you all what the top 10 previous water bodies are when we ask people that question, where were you before you came here today to the launch? And some of them, as we might expect, they're the big lakes, Lake Champlain, Lake George, Saratoga Lake, but others of them, things like the Atlantic Ocean, the Hudson River, Lake Ontario, those are very big waterways with very large numbers of potential entry points and exit points, and also very large numbers of additional aquatic invasive species that we don't want to ever get to our system. And so it's important for us to sort of have all of this information. Let's imagine, though, that we didn't have this information. We're fortunate that we've got that question as a part of our survey that's conducted each year by boat stewards. But imagine a different system that hasn't been asking that question or doesn't know which lakes already have AIS. Another thing that we can do is look at what the predictors of that sort of centrality are. And we can look at some of those same lake attributes and ask which of those lake attributes are associated with being a lake that has lots and lots of connections to other lakes. And it turns out that some of them we can again predict have basically to do with the number of amenities, and lots of these things are just driven by, in our system anyway, how big is the lake? Lots of lakes, big lakes have lots of launches, they have lots of amenities, they have lots of fishing opportunities, and they have lots of boat traffic, and that makes them sort of the central players or the hubs in the network that we're working with here. So the last thing I'm going to talk about before I close up is the second portion of the research that we've been doing in a separate analysis to look more at the social data that come out of the work that we do at the launches. And that is the question of, how effective is this approach that we've taken in the Adirondack Park of having 114 boat stewards that are at the launches, interacting with boaters, performing inspections and decontaminations. How well does this work? And also, what's the effectiveness of the New York State regulation at enhancing the adoption of the things that we want people to do, which is the basic clean, drain, dry behaviors that we hope folks will undertake on their own to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species. So in 2016, New York State passed a ban on the transport of aquatic invasive species on recreational watercraft, trailers, and tow vehicles, and this was renewed in the last couple of years. So this is known as the transport law. So it's actually against the law to transport aquatic invasive species on watercraft in New York State. And clean, drain, dry is sort of the basic principles that we like to share with people as to illustrate, how can you sort of do this yourself to make sure that you're in compliance with the law. Look at your boat, make sure that it's clean, drain out the live wells in the bilge, and make sure that it's dry. Those are some of the behaviors that are absolutely critical to sort of making sure that we are abiding by the transport law. So we had two objectives here, which were to determine the effectiveness of the steward program and the transport law and increasing visitor compliance with those clean, drain, dry practices, and then identifying the most influential variables that contribute to that compliance. Basically, how well is this working? And what are the things that are controlling whether or not it's working? And it's important to point out that there are kind of two different ways that we could measure compliance with the type of data that we have. One is what people tell us they're doing. So we ask them, what are the spread prevention measures that you have undertaken today, if any, to try to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species? So that's what they tell us. They might tell us they dried their boat, or they cleaned their boat, or they inspected their boat, for example. The other element of compliance, according to the legal sort of side of things, is the actual compliance. And the way that we can look at that is how many boats are passing inspection, basically. How many boats are showing up, not without any organisms on them, and therefore not transporting aquatic invasives. So again, in a sort of similar manner, we looked at a variety of different sets of information that we had available to us in our data set for their influence on those two things, on what people were telling us as far as reported compliance and on the actual compliance. Basic things like time of the day or the date or what sort of boat they were in, where it was registered, and then sort of more on the behavioral side, what were the spread prevention measures they were undertaking? What was the purpose of their trip? Were they there for fishing or recreation or research? One of the key questions we ask also is, have you met a boat steward before? Does that matter to compliance? Are you aware of the New York State transport law? Does that matter to compliance? And at least in 1 year, we have asked, can we count on you to undertake these measures? And so some basic patterns of what we have found. One is that the proportion of boaters that are reporting having taken at least one of those spread prevention measures is variable from year to year, but it does show an increase, a slight increase over time. One of the caveats to this is that we haven't, the WISPA survey that we use has not been exactly the same. It tends to change a little bit year to year. So it's not quite as straightforward. I have to kind of ask the question individually within each of the years and then kind of look at the trend recursively. But when we look at that, we do see that the proportion of folks that at least are reporting having undertaken one action or more is increasing. More strongly, and perhaps more importantly, the proportion of boats that are showing up clean shows a very strong and very significant increasing trend between 2015 and 2020, which is fantastic news. When we look into what the predictors of those are, for reported compliance, which boaters told us, yes, I did do those things. They tended to be boaters who passed the inspection. They had clean boats, not surprisingly. Luckily, they said they had met a steward before, which is terrific. Watercraft type was also influential. We had some types of watercraft that tended to report more compliance than others. Motorboats generally were more likely to report having undertaken some of these practices, not surprisingly, because some of these practices apply to motorboats, but not to other types of watercraft. Awareness of the regulation, importantly, was a predictor of reported compliance, and willingness to practice, saying yes to that question, you can count on me, was also a predictor of reported compliance with clean, drain, dry. In terms of actual compliance, which boats passed inspection and were therefore kind of certified as not transporting AIS in our system, launching boats more likely to arrive clean than retrieving boats, which is potentially not surprising if retrieving boats are coming off a lake that's already has an infestation and they have to travel through that to get off the lake. Purpose of the trip, people that were there for the purpose of recreation tended to more often be in compliance than fishing, for example. Trips, sometimes fishing derbies have lots and lots of rental boats, and maybe those folks don't have any awareness of what might be on their boat because it's not their boat. Awareness of the regulation, again, which was great. Location of registration, New York boaters were more likely to be in compliance than boats that were unregistered or boats that came from other states. And having reported undertaking spread prevention practices. And among those that they did report, the most reported ones were generally, yes, I inspected my boat, followed by I washed my boat, and then by having drained the bilge and drying their boat. So some general patterns to wrap up. One is just to say that it's important to point out that the proportion of boats that are actually problematic is fairly low. A very large proportion of boaters that we meet at the boat launch each year are either there for the first time that season, and they haven't been anywhere else, or they're only ever in that lake. So that represents a pretty small risk if they're only ever in the same lake all season long. Again, wonderful to hear that more than 85% of them report having encountered a boat steward before, and that number is increasing. Our colleague Sue O'Reilly likes to say that we've been doing this long enough that we've kind of become like the furniture, and people don't really notice us anymore. They're used to us. They know what we're there for, which is ultimately, if we work ourselves out of a job and people just do this on their own, it will be a wonderful thing. We do see that the compliance is high and it's increasing, especially with respect to the number of boats that are passing inspection. And we do see, with regard to what the actual law is, that awareness of that transport law does seem to have influenced both the reported and the actual levels of compliance. So to sort of wrap all of this up, although I have said that the overall risk is low, it doesn't go away. It is ever present, and thinking back to the list of lakes that people have reported coming from, it is very, very large. People come from all over the place, and some of the places they come from are places that have things that we really, really don't want to have in our system. And so the risk is always there, and we need to always be vigilant for it. With regard to the predictors of which lakes are vulnerable because they have high boat use, it's really generally all about those amenity factors. How big is your lake is a big driver, because that drives how many boat launches you have, whether you have a marina, whether you can rent boats, and all those sorts of things. With regard to lakes that are vulnerable because they have the right characteristics for establishment, we did find, not surprisingly, that the number of upstream invaded waterways are important drivers. If there's a hydrologic connection from one lake to another one and one of them is invaded, then that is a risk factor for the next one sort of downstream. And similarly, in this analysis, this has come out differently in other analyses, but in our data, we see a positive association between native plant community richness and the likelihood of those species becoming established. The overall risk is low, and the efficacy of our program appears to be high. We see a really high rate of folks having met us before. We see a high rate of adoption of undertaking these practices, and that is increasing over time, and the number of boats passing inspection is increasing strongly over time, which is great. I sort of reflect on this whole system, and I see something that is very, very complex and very connected because of us and the way that we move throughout the landscape. But what that tells me is that although it's a big challenge, the appropriate response to that kind of a problem is similarly a regional, coordinated, and highly connected approach to it. And I think that's what we are trying to do with the boat launch program and with partnering with other organizations to sort of have this far-reaching regional approach that is using a similar system in every lake and asking the right questions. And I think it's highly effective one. So that's what I've got, and I'm happy to answer questions that any of you have. And you can find me or Tom both always on email as well on our website. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Michale. So yeah, I just dropped some more information on Invasive Species Awareness Week into the chat. Also, feel free to add questions to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And Michale and I will do our best to answer those questions and get those back to you. One question, Michale, and I'm happy to jump in as well. Are there other plans to utilize key data that stewards collect at boat launches in the Adirondacks?
I think we would love to keep going with this analysis. We had grants to do this for, I believe we got those grants in 2019, and there are invasive species, correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but I think there are a number of invasive species funding opportunities almost every year, but research as a component of that isn't always a part of it, and we did benefit that year when it was. I think that we will continue to watch that, and when that's an opportunity, we'll think about our ability to do this, because the data set is very rich and there's lots of interesting questions. I should mention that we do have the sort of just the basic boating patterns piece. The first part that I talked about is a manuscript that's been submitted to lake and reservoir management, and hopefully we will see that in the world at some point. And we do hope also to put out the other information in the published literature as well. The aquatic invasive species literature is growing, but it's not enormous, and we can always sort of contribute to that. So I think we do have continued interest in looking at all of the ways that we can use the data. And one thing that I like to stress is that it's a challenge when the sorts of the questions on the survey that we do change year to year. And so my advice to other places and to ourselves is to try to be as consistent as we can with the questions year to year, because that just enables us to have more power to ask these questions when we ask the same question every year.
Yeah, thank you, Michale. And yeah, the DEC does release, not always annually, but aquatic invasive species management, education, sometimes research grants available to lake associations, community members, and nonprofit organizations. I'll also add, Michale mentioned this, and I'll put this in the chat. Sue O'Reilly, our awesome operations manager, also compiles location use summaries for all the lakes that we steward throughout the stewardship season every summer. And those are available on our website. So I just placed that in the chat. So that data is being used to affect management decisions, education decisions at lake associations across the Adirondack Park. And I'll also mention that the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, based out of the Nature Conservancy here in the Adirondacks, is also utilizing our data on a management project on the Lake Champlain shoreline at some locations on Central Lake Champlain. So Brian Green and the Aquatic Invasive Species team over there at APIP is utilizing that data from our stewards to determine what launches and locations, and then ultimately what plots of plants are best suited for management action for hand harvesting or mechanical harvesting in the future.
We should also mention that the two papers, the two reports that I talked about are on our website too. If you want to if you want to hear more about anything I just talked about, those are on there too.
Yeah, and I'll add those to the chat as well. We have one more question here. With the warmer spring and early summer season.
Well, Tom, you froze. I don't know if we lost Tom, but I can, oh, there he is. Terrestrial plants and trees, we might expect to see some migration in the Adirondacks due to a change in climate. Any thoughts on the potential for change of aquatic plant species? I have not looked into the literature for that question, but I see no reason why we wouldn't expect that. I'm generally working on the land side of things, but I certainly notice changes in bird communities as a result of warming climate and things moving up to higher latitudes. And I can imagine that aquatic plants, like anything else, might be adapting in new ways, and we may see some changes there too. Certainly, we have lots of terrestrial invasives that we know are being benefited in some ways by climate change.
Great, thanks, Michale. And I might have cut out there for a minute. Just to know if you want to touch on another question we have about HABs. Have we seen an increase in HABs this year with the early spring and early summer season?
I don't know that have we seen any HABs yet, Tom? Do you know?
Not confirmed locally.
Yeah.
I will say that some ideas, some things that we want to consider for good HAB weather is high temperature, low wind days. So thinking of those days of consecutive 80 degrees where our lake surface water is pretty warm, and those winds are fairly low. Those are good opportunities for HABs to form. So last week actually looked like a fairly HABby week that it could have been, but to my knowledge, we didn't have any reports from this past week.
The one paper that I have looked at on some of that suggests that we're not 100% certain of the increasing, I think this was a statewide paper, of whether HABs are, truly occurring more than they have in the past, or if it's just that we now have some very good mechanisms for reporting them and there's a higher awareness, and therefore we might be seeing, they may have been taking place, but we have a better ability to extract that information because there is, ways to report that and tracking systems on the part of the state and stuff. I don't know if that's the case just for Adirondack lakes, but my perception is that they are happening. Loud on my porch.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions coming into the chat. So I just want to say thank you for everybody for joining us this evening. Thanks for taking time out of your Thursday evening on this rainy evening. We are gonna put this recording on our YouTube channel, and it'll also be available on our social media pages. So if there's anything you want to refresh on, and those reports that Michale mentioned and discussed tonight are also on our website. So just appreciate all of you for joining us, and keep in touch. Yeah, thanks for being here.
Thank you.